Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Dawn Hansen. I'm the Executive Director of the Bulkley Valley Research Center. Thrilled this afternoon to be hosting this seminar with Dr. Elston Dzus on the traditional territory of the Ginnamden clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And I'm located in Telkwa on the bank of the Bulkley River. The Bulkley Valley Research Center is located in Smithers, BC, and is entering its 20th year of operation. I'd like to acknowledge our funders that help support this seminar series: the Bulkley Valley Credit Union, the Bulkley Valley Community Foundation, TD Friends of the Environment Fund. We don't have ongoing funding for our seminar series, so the support that we do get from these funders, as well as the support from our members, is really appreciated. We'll get started right away so that we don't run out of time for this presentation. Elston Dzus is going to provide an overview of the world's longest running bald eagle research project that's been happening in Besnard Lake in Saskatchewan. Elston Dzus is better known in Alberta, Canada as a caribou biologist, but his roots are in avian ecology. He's a transplant from northern Saskatchewan, where he grew up at a lake resort and spent his spare time fishing, hunting, and observing a lone bald eagle nest. His high school interest in raptors led to an undergraduate research opportunity in 1984 that changed his life. That one summer, boating and canoeing around 7 lakes, surveying bald eagles and other water birds, turned into 2 and then 3 as he completed a master's degree. Except for a few years while he pursued a PhD on mallards, he has migrated back to Besnard annually to continue what has become a lifelong passion: studying bald eagles on Besnard Lake in north central Saskatchewan. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us, Elston. It's great to have you, and welcome.
Thanks, Don. I see some of my colleagues on this project are actually online. So hi, Sherry. Hi, Peter. Hi, Lauren. Peter is actually one of the sort of people that started this project. So Peter Gerard, hi to you in Saskatoon. So we've got a bit of a whirlwind. I do have a 1 o'clock hard stop and a lot of information to go over, but I will make sure that I leave time for questions. So coming to you from northeastern Alberta, the Treaty 8 territory and home of many Métis people, and Besnard Lake, I'm not sure which treaty area it is, but Cree nations and Métis people up there. So this story, it has a variety of sort of themes within it, from history to curiosity and adventure, to obviously commitment to have a project that is, 54 years and counting, initiated by John and his wife, Naomi Gerard, and then my wife and I got involved, and our son Zach in 1984, 86, 87. And have sort of continued on and are now sort of bringing another generation of eagle enthusiasts into it. So from a history perspective, 1782 is actually the time when the project, the inspiration for it got started. And I'll explain a bit of the rationale as I go through some of the history. Clearly in British Columbia, you guys see bald eagles all the time. You've had a long, stable population there, with a variety of work done in British Columbia and Alaska over the years. But some of the history that links to Besnard Lake actually goes back to when the U.S. adopted the bald eagle as their national bird. Declines in the mid-1800s, largely driven by shooting, began to set the stage. In 1940, the U.S. put in the Bald Eagle Protection Act. And while that sort of prohibited shooting, declines continued, and many of those declines were associated with either DDT or in some places habitat loss. DDT, as an insecticide, was finally banned in 1972, and in 1973, the United States brought in the Endangered Species Act. Bald eagles were immediately listed as endangered. And it's this series of events that led to a combination of interest, both in the US and in Canada, but also funding. And some of that funding led to some of the early work that got this project off the ground. Just as a FYI, it was 2007 when, as a result of massive recovery efforts throughout North America, the bald eagle was removed from the U.S. Endangered Species Act and is thriving now throughout the North American continent. So another aspect of their theme is inspiration. And this fellow, Charles Broley, he was a banker in Winnipeg. He retired in the late 1930s, and he was sort of a trendsetter. He was an early snowbird. And for a retirement hobby, he began climbing and banding bald eagle nests. And so he was one of John Gerard's sort of early inspirations, and his sort of this attitude of there's not a nest tree I can't climb is something that John and his colleagues took to heart. You know, on the y-axis on this graph, it's got the number of young banded by Charles Broley in Florida. And so this is that snowbird aspect, and the years are along the bottom. And you can see that just tied to his banding efforts, and his, you know, the number of nests he was climbing to is phenomenal. But this link to this dramatic reduction in eagles in the southern U.S. And all the way up through Ontario in Canada shows the effects of DDT. Another inspiration for John Gerard, who eventually became my mentor, was Dr. Stewart Houston, a radiologist in Saskatoon and a friend and colleague of Dr. John Gerard Sr. And Dr. Houston is renowned for banding more great horned owls than anyone else in the world. And he began to take a young John Gerard Jr. Out, you know, when John was kind of a preteen. And then you can see in the top right there that John, as a teenager, is out there. He's banding a variety of different raptors, working alongside Stewart Houston. Adventure was always a theme with John and his brother Peter and their friend Doug Whitfield. And this northern Saskatchewan adventure sort of brings those sort of ideas of raptor banding together with northern Saskatchewan into an idea that got both John and his friend Doug Whitfield interested in how can we merge these two into one opportunity. So then bring in some funding over the next few years from federal and provincial sources. They began to ask the question, well, are there bald eagles nesting in northern Saskatchewan? A fairly famous book, The Birds of Canada by Taverner in 1934, his answer to that question was that there's virtually none. Clearly, he was ill-informed. So John and his colleagues in 1967 began to sort of gather local knowledge from trappers, bush pilots, and they began looking, and they found. And they also sort of embodied that attitude of Charles Broley that said, you know, there's not a nest I can't climb. And John, in his early 70s, is still climbing to nests, although he's a bit more discriminating than he was perhaps in the late 1960s. So they did find nests, they did band young, and that began sort of this passion and commitment that continues through to today. Again, I mentioned they had a variety of provincial and federal funding sources, and they began to do aerial surveys in northern Saskatchewan. They eventually actually branched out into Manitoba as well, but they began to look throughout, the lake country of northern Saskatchewan for eagles, and they found a lot. The numbers are impressive. 246 breeding areas. Just the term breeding area, it's an area that's got one or more nests that are defended by a territorial pair. The term successful breeding areas relates to those that raise young. And then the number of young shown here, the number of birds that reach sort of mid-July when we consider them to have fledged. So they, after a couple of years of flying around northern Saskatchewan, they decided that they wanted to begin a bit of a focal study area. And they knew that the road was going to be coming into Besnard Lake, which is in north central Saskatchewan, in a couple of years. So this, again, we're talking 1967, 1968 here. So Besnard Lake is along the southern boundary of the Precambrian Shield. It's a fairly large lake, 40 kilometers north to south, with about 250 islands that you can see and 500 that you can't, but the propeller on your boat will find it. And the shown here is the distribution of nests in yellow and red, just to give you an example of what kind of a distribution you've got. So John's soon-to-be wife arrived in 1970, and they wanted to sort of look at what can we understand from a biology perspective in a bit more depth than just banding. And so the crew of young, aspiring eagle enthusiasts began to do a whole variety of things. Putting up blind platforms that were hardly safe from a current year perspective, but they managed to go relatively accident-free from observation perspective, and did a lot of work looking at behavior, diet aspects, looking at how the birds were changing in terms of plumage throughout the nest raising period, and doing a lot of banding. Some banding was done right in the nest, and others they were lowered to the ground and banded on the ground. So here's a picture of Naomi at a eagle nest, and John and Naomi with a couple of young on the ground. As the project began to sort of take flight, the idea of how can we sort of better follow their movements, and at a conference in Colorado, the idea of wing markers was brought to bear, and they began putting these wing markers on young. So this was in the in the 70s, and when I took on the project as a partner in 84 through 86, 87, there were still birds that were banded, almost 20 years ago or 20 years previous, that still had these wing markers on. So it began to sort of, this is kind of before the days of radio telemetry that could fit onto a bird like this. But it was able to provide information as to where the birds from Besnard Lake were traveling for their wintering, because northern Saskatchewan freezes up in the winter, and so they move south and they move to the southeast all the way down the Missouri River. They then sort of decided, well, in addition to sort of a lake-centered focus, let's take the idea of the work that they had done sort of in 67, 68 and develop a systematic survey approach to look for eagles across northern Saskatchewan. And so they set up survey strata lines, and then they selected different survey sites shown in circles here. And each circle, while they may be different in diameter, they had roughly the same length of shoreline, because eagles, as you well know from living in British Columbia, that they're tightly tied to water. 98% of the eagle nests on Besnard Lake you can see from a boat, so most of them are within 50 meters of shore. So they did this survey throughout northern Saskatchewan. And they found a tremendous number of nests, as well as adults and immature. So, close to the estimated with extrapolation that for northern Saskatchewan, close to 4,000 breeding areas, and an estimate of over 14,000 bald eagles. So an impressive number. Clearly, Taverner, when he wrote that book in 1934, was poorly informed. So then they took sort of that survey approach and said, in addition to knowing where the nests are, can we design a survey to sort of count all eagles, not just those that are nesting, and began to develop a survey approach. Took Besnard Lake, and they, with approximately 400 kilometers of shoreline, divided the lake into 8-kilometer sections. So there's about 50 of those sections on the lake, and then began to use this approach where they would drive each survey section with a boat, counting eagles, looking for nests, counting other water-associated birds. And so again, this is a boat-based approach, and was able to come up with lake population estimates. And it's interesting, the total number of birds, combination of adults and immatures, has remained roughly stable at about 100 between adults and immatures over the years. But what we have seen, and I'm going to touch on this in a few slides, is we are seeing more through the years. We're seeing more adults, more breeding pairs, and less immatures. And so this is, sort of being driven by territorial behavior, as the breeding pairs are not very tolerant, especially in sort of May, June, and July, of competition from immatures or other adults. So in 1980 to 84, Gary Bortolotti arrived on the scene and did his PhD there, looked at a variety of aspects, but one of the parts to his study that has continued to sort of serve us well is, he was able to determine an easy way to differentiate the chicks in terms of whether they're male or female. Sadly, Gary passed away a few years ago, but his daughter Lauren and son Eric continue to come up to Besnard Lake. So the two measurements that quickly you can determine whether it's a male or a female. One of them is bill depth, and here's a picture of Naomi doing a measurement of bill depth with the calipers. And then the other one is foot pad. So it's the length of the foot pad, not including the talons. And this particular bird here is just over 150 millimeters, and so immediately I know that that's a female. Females are larger than males in raptors, and so here's the graph that Gary put together as part of his PhD dissertation, showing clear differentiation by the time the birds are about 60 days of age. And so we continue to use this technique for determining sex of the young that we're banding. This now ties us back to sort of that continental recovery of bald eagles. And there were a number of discussions between Canada and the US. And, can they utilize bald eagles from the north to help restore populations in the south? And so through the mid 1980s, different states established relationships with different provinces. British Columbia was involved, Alaska was quite heavily involved, and Saskatchewan established a relationship with Pennsylvania. And so between, I think it was 1986 actually through 89, Saskatchewan was donating bald eagles down to Pennsylvania. I think they were taking 12 young per year, and they were taking only, if a nest had 2, they would take 1. If a nest had 1, they wouldn't take any. And so it actually, I got involved in that project. They paid for aerial surveys on Besnard Lake for the 2 years of my master's project in 86, 87. And I got to go along on some of the sort of capture trips. And so you can see how well that approach worked in terms of sort of kicking off the recovery, which has now been quite dramatic. And there's graphs like this that you can find on the internet for most of the continental US. So as mentioned in the sort of the introduction of bio for myself, my interests in bald eagles go back to, when I was a high school student in Goodsoil, Saskatchewan, and we had one nest that I would go and I would sit and watch. When I got to university, the idea was planted for an opportunity to do an NSERC undergraduate scholarship. And so I thought, well, what could I do? and I'd always been interested in bald eagles. And so I kept asking around the University of Saskatchewan, and this one name kept coming up. The answer was sort of, no, there's nobody here, but there's this guy, John Gerard. I think he's in Manitoba. And so John, by that time, had become a medical doctor and a PhD researcher, but his folks lived in Saskatoon. And so I contacted Dr. Gerard Sr., got the number for Dr. Gerard Jr., called him up in December, introduced myself in one phone call, also asked him, would he be interested in being my supervisor for an undergraduate project? He said yes. Next question was, I can get funding for my personal time, but would you be willing to cover my expenses? And without hesitation, John's answer was yes. So we put together a proposal, and I began doing lake surveys throughout the summer on Namibin Lake, Besnard Lake, and the small lakes in between. And what I ended up finding was that despite the fact that Besnard Lake is roughly the same size as Namibin Lake, it has 3 times the number of eagles. So this in turn led to my master's project that Connie and Zach and I completed in '86 and '87, and where we specifically looked at Besnard and Namibin Lake, not the smaller ones in between. And we looked at nesting habitat. We looked at sort of human disturbance, number of cottages, number of campers, number of fishermen, but also the food supply. And as with many things in ecology, it came down to food supply. Cisco, which are in the Coragonid or Whitefish family, are the #1 prey of bald eagles on Besnard Lake. By number, white suckers are more important from a biomass perspective. But when I did a bunch of test netting, and what we found was that fish mass on Besnard Lake was higher than on Namibin Lake. And in fact, if you look at water quality, as well as invertebrates, it was all higher on Besnard Lake. And this actually ties to the sort of the location of where Besnard is. It's receiving nutrient-rich inflow from the boreal plain ecoregion. And so that flows into the western side of Besnard Lake. And we actually see differences in density, with higher densities, faster growth of eagles on the western side compared to the eastern and northern portions of Besnard. John and Gary published the book, The Bald Eagle Haunts and Habits of a Wilderness Monarch, in 1988. And this is quite a fascinating book, and I think you can actually still find it if you sort of Google for it. There was a bit of a hiatus. We continued to monitor every year, and there were a couple of more research publications in between sort of that '88 and 2013. But sort of the next sort of big evolution in the publications that we began to put out was this density-dependent reproduction aspect. And you can only really get at something like this type of question if you have a long-term data set. So here's a graph of the breeding population size from the late 1960s through to 2020. You can see that the population size represented by the white dots of occupied breeding areas increased fairly rapidly in the earlier decades, has tapered off, but still is showing some increase in the most recent decade. And the number of successful pairs, relatively stable, but you'll see even in the past 5 to 10 years, we're still seeing numbers that in some years are higher than we were seeing in previous decades. So the breeding population increased along with the continental increase in the early decades and continues to creep up. But from a density dependent perspective, what you would expect to see is that as you have a higher density of eagles, you should start to see declines in reproductive performance. And that is indeed what we ended up seeing. Whether you looked at mean brood size at fledging, or productivity, which is the number of young per occupied breeding area. both of which are decline when you compare it to population size. So this in and of itself was a pretty fantastic finding that, again, you would only find if you've got a long-term data set like we had. We're currently working on a project that results from sort of a big fire. It was about 150,000 hectare fire that burnt the shoreline of roughly the northern third of Besnard Lake. And if you look at this graph here, in 2015, we had a very low number of successful nests, and that was in large part because 8 nests were burnt up in that fire. So we're just working up the analysis in terms of what the impacts are, and we'll be putting out a publication on that, showing the sort of initial response and then the recovery in that northern third of the lake since then. One of the more recent aspects that we've sort of brought into our work was for years we were using a conventional boat-based approach for doing nest checks, using binoculars, counting the number of young, either climbing the nest tree or climbing an adjacent tree, or sometimes climbing a hill and looking down into the nest. But I've always been interested in being a pilot, and the closest thing that I've been able to come to is in 2016, I picked up my first drone, and we began to use it for assessing the status of bald eagles. So here's a shot from the drone, and you get some pretty amazing views. And so we wanted to look at what is the accuracy of the 2 different techniques, how much effort. So we used time spent at the nest as well as distance traveled by the 2 teams. And we also looked at disturbance effects on the breeding pair. What we ended up finding, I'm just going to sort of hit the highlights, was that both approaches were quite accurate. We found roughly the same number of young. The only difference for Team Drone that Connie and I were on was that we found 1 nest on the last day in the last hour as we were sort of coming home, and that we put the drone up and it had 2 young in it. But the total number of breeding areas that we saw in different categories, be it empty or occupied or successful, were almost identical between the 2. And so in summary, what we ended up finding was that, the question of to drone or not to drone, they are highly effective at checking nests. When we arrive at a nest location, put the anchor down, I launch the drone off the deck of the boat, and I can be up and down in an average of about 3.5 minutes. Some as short as 1 minute. If the nest is quite tricky to see into because of the foliage, it might take me up to 10 minutes, but the average is 3.5. So significant savings of time compared to an average of closer to 20 minutes. And if you, in terms of at the nest, and if you have to go back and visit that nest 2, 3, 4 times to get an accurate count, you might have to drive, if it's on the far end of the lake, you might have to drive 30 kilometers to do that assessment. From a disturbance perspective, didn't show the results, but minimal disturbance through the use of the drone. From a safety perspective, I'm not having to climb to the nest trees, and as I get older, I am less enamored by climbing to the trees, and Connie is quite pleased that I am keeping my feet in the boat. And it's also fun using these drones. The imagery that you get is quite spectacular. So 2017, the project celebrated 50 years, and you can see sort of multiple generations of people that have been influenced and exposed to the Besnard Lake project. It has been a fun and a life-changing experience. The cabin in the background there on the right-hand portion was built by Naomi and John and Peter in the late 60s, early 70s, and it continues to sort of serve as the hub. Our cabin is up the lake about 20 kilometers from this one. In celebration of the 50 years, we sort of collaborated with the Canadian Geographic, and they put out a wonderful article. Nick Walker was the editor and author, profiling the Besnard Lake project, and also now nominated John and Naomi for the Conservation Award with Nature Saskatchewan, recognizing their sort of lifetime achievement. So with that, I have gone through a whirlwind of information. I've got a short video that I'll show. I think we've got time to show that, and then we can open it up to discussion. So here's a drone shot, and they've banded the young on the ground, and John is now returning the young to the nest. And whenever he does that, he always has a bit of a conversation with them, thanking him and saying goodbye. So there's John chatting with the young eagle as it's now sort of befuddled as to what has just happened. The clarity from these drones is absolutely amazing. One of the things that I've done in the last 3 years is I've added what are called first-person view goggles. So I'm actually seeing what the camera is seeing, and that has helped from an effectiveness and efficiency perspective quite dramatically. There have been many people involved. This is just sort of a snapshot of a few of the people that have been involved over the years. And so thank you to all of those, and sort of future generations of people that are going to be involved. We continue to be dedicated. We're now sort of in a transition to retirement, and that will allow us an opportunity to spend even more time up at the lake. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Dawn, for opening up of questions.